Today we are tackling one of the most famous quotes in history, a single line that has shaped entire philosophies. But what if the story behind it, the whole story, reveals something completely different? What if it's not about peace, but about a plan?
You know this line, right? Of course you do. It's powerful, it sounds final, and it seems to send a crystal clear message. Violence is a dead end. For centuries, this has been the go-to quote to argue for complete non-resistance. But the full story? Well, that's where things get really interesting. So let's picture the scene. It's the middle of the night, Garden of Gethsemane. Suddenly, an armed mob shows up to arrest Jesus. And in this moment of pure chaos and loyalty, his disciple Peter does what he thinks is right. He whips out a sword and attacks, slicing off the ear of the high priest's servant. And that's when Jesus fires back with that sharp rebuke. Now, the common take on this is pretty straightforward. Jesus is shutting down the violence. The message feels like a total rejection of using force, even to defend yourself or, your master. It's become a cornerstone for pacifism. But if we just stop there, we hit a massive, massive problem. So, this is the contradictory command. And this is where the puzzle really begins. Because that whole idea of absolute pacifism, it kind of falls apart when you look at what Jesus told his disciples just a few hours before this whole garden scene went down. And here it is. This is the core of the whole puzzle. In the garden, Jesus says, "Put your sword back." But just hours earlier, in the Gospel of Luke, he gave them a totally different instruction. If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Whoa. So, what gives? How can the same person tell his followers to arm themselves for defense, and then, a little while later, chew one of them out for actually using a sword in defense? Did he just contradict himself? To figure this out, we have to dig a little deeper into the evidence. Right? Just like any good investigation, we've got to analyze the evidence. So let's start with that first command, the one that seems so bizarre if you're only looking at this through a pacifist lens, the order to go out and buy a sword. Look, Jesus was being incredibly practical here. He was basically telling them, hey, things are about to get really dangerous. Their mission was entering a new phase. They weren't going to be welcomed everywhere anymore. They were going to face real hostility and needed to be able to protect themselves. A sword was a necessary tool for survival on the road. This wasn't some metaphor. He wasn't telling them to buy swords to peel their fruit. Okay, but hold on. You might have heard this counter-argument. When the disciples proudly show him 2 swords, Jesus says, "It is enough." And some people take that to mean, see, he only wanted a symbolic number, not enough for a real fight. But is that what he actually meant? This all comes down to language and context. Most scholars point out that this phrase was a really common idiom for ending a conversation. It's kind of like us saying, okay, that's enough of that, or topic closed. The disciples just weren't getting the seriousness of the situation, so Jesus just cut the discussion short. He wasn't saying 2 swords were enough to fight off a Roman-backed mob. He was saying, enough talk, we're moving on. Okay, so we've pretty much established that Jesus wasn't against the idea of self-defense in principle. So that brings us right back to the garden. If having a sword was okay, why did Jesus shut Peter down so hard for using his? Well, it turns out there were 2 critical reasons. Peter's big move wasn't wrong because violence is always wrong. It was wrong because this specific act of violence at this specific moment was a huge mistake on 2 different levels. One was tactical and the other was divine. First off, let's just be tactical for a second. Peter, one guy with 1 sword, is jumping a mob that's armed to the teeth with swords and clubs. What did he think was going to happen? Fighting back wasn't going to save Jesus. It was a completely futile, suicidal gesture that would have gotten Peter killed, period. Jesus was actually saving his life by telling him to stop. And that leads us to the second and much, much deeper reason. In Jesus' mind, this arrest wasn't just some random tragedy. It was a necessary part of a divine plan. Peter, in his very human, very understandable attempt to protect his friend, was actually getting in the way of the very reason Jesus came. He wasn't surrendering out of weakness. He was surrendering out of obedience to that bigger plan. So, with all this evidence on the table, the command to buy swords, the tactical reality of the situation, and the divine plan in motion, we can now go back to that super famous quote and deliver a new verdict. That quote isn't some universal law that bans all use of force forever. No, it's a specific warning to Peter in that moment against reckless, impulsive, and totally useless violence that would have gotten him killed and obstructed a divine purpose. It was a warning against taking matters into your own hands when you don't understand the bigger picture.
So the real lesson here isn't a simple debate between pacifism and self-defense. It's about something much more nuanced. It's about the huge difference between legitimate defense and ill-timed, counterproductive aggression. It's a call for wisdom over impulse, to make sure our actions align with the reality of a situation, not just with our emotions.
And you know, this whole investigation into one verse actually reveals a much bigger, much more important lesson. A principle that applies to how we read and interpret almost anything. It's about the power of context.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, it's that a single quote without its story can be incredibly misleading. To really get it, you have to look at the whole picture, the timing, the narrative, even the apparent contradictions. And it teaches us that our actions should be guided by wisdom, not just raw impulse. At the end of the day, it all boils down to one thing: context is king. And that really just leaves us with a final question to chew on. This whole time, we've been re-examining one widely accepted idea just by looking at its full context. So it makes you wonder, what other truths in our lives, in our beliefs, or in our world do we just accept at face value without ever stopping to investigate the full story?